The rain had been falling since morning, not hard enough to scare anyone inside, just steady enough to make the day feel heavier than it needed to be. In Seattle, that kind of rain didn't announce itself. It lingered. It stayed. Ethan Walker sat by the window of his small house, his wheelchair angled just enough so he could see the street without being seen. Cars passed slowly, tires hissing on wet pavement. A delivery truck stopped 2 houses down. Someone laughed under an umbrella. Life moved with quiet efficiency, as if nothing inside this house had stalled. Behind Ethan, the closet door was half open. Inside, a pair of prosthetic legs stood upright, perfectly balanced, untouched. They had cost more than his truck, more than the roof over his head. Carbon fiber, titanium joints. Precision engineering meant to give a man his life back. They were covered in dust. Ethan didn't look at them. He never did. He kept his eyes on the glass, on the way rain blurred the world until everything looked far enough away to be harmless. "You still watching the weather like it's going to change its mind?" his father asked. Frank Walker stood in the doorway with a mug of coffee gone cold. He hadn't meant the question to sound tired, but it did anyway. Ethan shrugged. "Just checking if it's still there." Frank forced a small smile and wheeled closer, resting his hand on the back of the chair. He wanted to say something useful, something that would land. Instead, he said the thing he always said. "They say it'll clear up by evening." Ethan nodded, even though both of them knew it wouldn't. A few miles away, in a city park most people avoided on days like this, something moved low against the ground. At first glance, it looked like a piece of trash dragged loose by the rain, a dark shape near the edge of the path where mud swallowed everything it touched. Then it shifted, slowly, painfully. A German shepherd pulled itself forward with its front legs, claws digging into wet earth. Its back legs barely followed, leaving faint, uneven lines in the mud. Its coat was matted, ribs pressing sharply against skin stretched too tight. One ear hung lower than the other, torn long ago and never fixed. Each movement cost it something. A jogger slowed, frowned, then crossed to the other side of the path. A woman with a stroller stopped, whispered something, and turned back the way she came. Someone raised a phone, then lowered it, unsure what to do with a moment like this. The dog didn't look at them. Its eyes were fixed ahead, amber and unblinking, locked on a point no one else could see. Back in the house, Frank cleared his throat. "I'm going to the park, just for a bit." Ethan didn't answer right away. "You don't have to come," Frank added quickly. "I just thought some air might help. For me." That got a reaction. Ethan exhaled through his nose. "You always say that. And you always come anyway." Silence settled between them, the kind that had learned how to live there. "Fine," Ethan said at last. "Give me a minute." Frank nodded and turned away before Ethan could change his mind. The park smelled like wet leaves and cold dirt. Frank pushed the wheelchair along the path, careful around puddles, careful not to rush. Ethan kept his hands resting lightly on the wheels, not helping, not resisting. They hadn't spoken since leaving the house. Then Ethan saw it. "Stop." Frank slowed. "What is it?" Ethan leaned forward slightly, squinting through the rain. Near the oak trees, something dark shifted again. "Dad," he said, quieter now. "Do you see that?" Frank followed his gaze. "Looks like a dog." They stopped a few yards away. The shape lifted its head. The dog didn't bark. It didn't growl. It didn't try to run. Instead, it started moving towards them. Not fast, not straight, just forward. Frank took a step back without realizing it. "Easy," he murmured, more to himself than the animal. "Easy there." The dog ignored him. It crawled. Each pull of its front legs left a smear of mud. Its breath came shallow and uneven. Rain slid off its nose, dripping from whiskers that trembled with effort. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. "No," he said under his breath. The dog was close enough now that he could see the scars. Old ones, new ones, the kind that didn't come from accidents. "Dad," Ethan said sharply, "we should go." Frank reached for the handles. "You're right. We don't know if it's sick." The dog stopped at the foot of the wheelchair. For a moment, nothing happened. Then it lowered its head and rested it gently against Ethan's lap, against the empty space where his legs used to be. The contact wasn't dramatic. There was no whine, no plea, just weight. Real weight, warm, alive. Ethan's breath caught so hard it hurt. Images flashed behind his eyes, sand, heat, a different dog. A voice calling his name through static. He clenched his fists. "Get it away," he whispered, panic rising fast and sharp. "Dad, get it away." Frank moved, but the dog didn't react. It didn't flinch. It didn't bare its teeth. It stayed. Ethan's heart hammered. He waited for fear to take over completely. It didn't. Instead, something else pushed through. Confusion, then anger, then something dangerously close to grief. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, his voice breaking despite himself. The dog lifted its head just enough to look at him. Its eyes weren't wild. They weren't empty. They were tired. Frank swallowed hard. "Ethan, I think he's been waiting." Ethan laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Waiting for what? For me?" The dog shifted closer, pressing its head back down, as if that answered everything. Rain continued to fall around them. People passed at a distance, glancing, then looking away. Somewhere a siren wailed and faded. Ethan stared down at the dog, at the mud on its fur, at the way its body shook from cold and effort. "You've got the wrong guy," he said quietly. "They all think I'm done." The dog didn't move. It didn't need to. It had already chosen. Before the war, Ethan Walker was not the kind of man people told dramatic stories about. He didn't dominate a room. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. He was the guy others looked for when things went wrong. Back then, his mornings started before sunrise. Push-ups on cold concrete. Boots lined perfectly under the bunk. Gear checked twice, then checked again. Not because anyone was watching, but because someone might depend on it later. Ethan wasn't fearless. He was dependable. In the platoon, that mattered more. When orders came down, he didn't question them out loud. He listened. He nodded. He executed. If a younger Marine forgot something, Ethan didn't yell. He quietly handed it over. If someone froze under pressure, Ethan stepped in without comment, absorbing the weight so others could keep moving. That was his role. Not the hero, the anchor. His father, Frank Walker, had raised him that way without ever saying the words. Frank spent most of his life working maintenance for the city. Pipes, boilers, broken doors in public buildings, no one noticed unless they failed. He believed in clocks that ran on time and hands that showed up every day. He believed you fixed what was broken, paid your bills, and didn't complain about things you couldn't change. At dinner, Frank didn't ask Ethan how he felt about the war. He asked if Ethan had eaten enough, if his boots were holding up, if the guys under him were doing okay. That was love, in their language. When Ethan deployed, Frank stood on the tarmac with his hands in his jacket pockets, nodding like this was just another shift change. "Do your job," he said. "Come back." Ethan nodded back. "Always." For a while that promise held. Then came the explosion. It wasn't cinematic. There was no slow motion, no heroic last stand, just heat, noise, pressure so sudden it knocked the thought out of his head. 1 second Ethan was shouting into the radio. The next, the ground wasn't where it should have been. When he woke up, the sky was white, too bright. His ears rang like metal being struck underwater. Someone was yelling his name, but it sounded far away. He tried to stand. Nothing happened. He looked down and saw where his legs ended. Not blood everywhere. Not horror the way movies show it. Just absence. Clean, shocking absence. Later, in the hospital, doctors spoke in careful tones. Surgeons explained timelines. Therapists talked about progress, about technology, about how lucky he was to be alive. Lucky. Ethan nodded through all of it. That's what he'd always done. Took the information. Filed it away. Prepared for the next task. But there was no next task. He couldn't lead patrols from a hospital bed. He couldn't be the one others leaned on when he needed help, just to sit up. When the paperwork came through, it said, medically discharged. When the uniform came off, it stayed off. Back home, people tried to be kind. Neighbors brought casseroles. Old friends said things like, "You're still you and you'll figure it out." Frank said less. He watched more. He noticed how Ethan stopped correcting people, how he let conversations drift without anchoring them, how his son, who once lived by checklists and responsibility, now spent hours staring out a window as if waiting for instructions that never came. Ethan didn't break because he lost his legs. He broke because he lost his place. In the Marines, he had been useful, needed, trusted. In civilian life, he was told to rest, to heal, to be patient. Patience felt like failure. The prosthetics arrived in sleek black cases, accompanied by specialists who smiled too much. They explained the process, the training, the discomfort. Ethan listened, nodded, thanked them. Then he put the legs in the closet and closed the door. Standing again wasn't the problem. Standing for nothing was. He didn't know who he was without someone depending on him. And until he figured that out, it felt safer not to try at all. That was the man sitting by the window when the rain fell. Not a hero, not a tragedy, just someone who had always carried weight, suddenly told to set it down, with no idea what came next. The park was quieter than it should have been for a Saturday afternoon. Rain had a way of thinning people out, leaving only those with somewhere to be or nowhere else to go. A man in a running jacket slowed when he saw the dog. He pulled one earbud out, frowned, then shook his head and jogged off the path, giving the animal a wide berth. A woman with a small terrier scooped her dog into her arms and turned around without looking back. "Someone should call animal control," a voice said from a distance. Another voice answered, "I already did." The German shepherd heard none of it, or if he did, it didn't matter. He was crouched low near the edge of the path, ribs sharp under rain-darkened fur, front paws trembling as they pressed into the mud. Every instinct in his body should have told him to run. Strays learned that early. Move fast. Don't trust. Don't stay where people could hurt you. But this dog didn't move away. He waited. Frank Walker stood behind the wheelchair, tense. "We really shouldn't be this close, Ethan." Ethan didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the dog. The animal lifted his head slowly. His ears twitched, not at the voices around him, but at the sound of the wheelchair's brakes releasing. That was when he changed direction. He didn't approach the path. He didn't look at Frank. He ignored the half-opened bag of food someone had dropped nearby. He angled straight toward Ethan. "Hey," Frank said, stepping forward instinctively. "Easy, boy." The dog didn't hesitate. He lowered himself further. Bellies, almost scraping the ground, and began to crawl. Not the quick, desperate crawl of fear, but something deliberate. Measured. Each pull forward cost him effort, and he paid it willingly. Ethan's breath shortened. "Dad, no." The distance closed. The dog reached the wheelchair and stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the dog lifted his head and rested it gently against Ethan's lap, against the space where Ethan's legs should have been. The contact hit like a shockwave. Ethan's vision tunneled. The park vanished. The rain turned to dust. His chest seized as memories slammed into him without warning. The smell of burning rubber. A sharp command shouted over radio static. A body falling where it shouldn't have. "No!" Ethan gasped, hands gripping the wheels. "No, no, no!" His heart raced, wild and uneven. His shoulders locked as if bracing for impact that never came. "Ethan!" Frank reached for him. "It's just a dog. You're here. You're safe." But Ethan wasn't hearing him. The dog didn't move. He didn't flinch at Ethan's shaking. He didn't back away from the panic radiating off the man in the chair. He stayed exactly where he was. Slowly, the dog shifted his weight, pressing his head a little more firmly, grounding himself there. A steady, solid presence where nothing steady had existed in years. The flash of memory broke. Ethan's breathing slowed, uneven at first, then gradually finding rhythm. His hands loosened their grip. His gaze dropped to the top of the dog's head, wet fur darkened by rain. The dog let out a long, quiet breath. Ethan swallowed hard. His throat burned. "What are you doing?" he whispered. Not in anger, not in fear, just confusion. The dog didn't answer. He simply closed his eyes. Frank stood frozen, his hands hovering uselessly, watching something he didn't understand but felt deep in his bones. The people who had lingered nearby stopped talking. Even the rain seemed to soften, as if the world itself had leaned in. Ethan stared down at the animal, his mind strangely quiet now. He didn't reach out. Not yet. But he didn't pull away either. In a park full of people walking past, phones buzzing and lives moving on, a broken dog made his first choice. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan stayed still long enough to let something choose him back. The rain never really stopped. It softened at times, thinned into something that felt more like mist than water, but it never fully went away. It clung to everything. The trees, the benches, the shoulders of people passing through the park with their heads down. Ethan stayed where he was. Frank suggested leaving more than once, quietly, carefully, but Ethan didn't respond. His hands rested on the armrests of the wheelchair, fingers slightly curled, as if they were holding on to something invisible. The dog remained at his feet, head still resting against the empty space on Ethan's lap, breathing slow and steady. That breathing did something to him. It pulled him backward, not all at once, not violently, just enough to open a door he had kept sealed for years. The park faded around the edges. The wet grey sky bled into a different colour. Pale, blinding, a white-blue glare that pressed down from above instead of drifting sideways. The smell changed first, from damp leaves and cold soil to dust. Hot dust, the kind that coated your tongue and stayed there no matter how much water you drank. Ethan was standing then, whole. His boots were planted firmly in the ground, weight balanced, rifle strap biting into his shoulder the way it always did on long patrols. Sweat ran down his spine beneath his vest, collecting at his lower back. The radio crackled once, then again, and ahead of him, moving with quiet confidence, was Gunner. Gunner never rushed. He worked the ground the way a craftsman worked wood. Patient, precise, nose low, tail steady. Every few steps he glanced back, not for permission, but confirmation. We're still together. Ethan remembered trusting that glance more than he trusted maps. Back in the park, the German shepherd shifted slightly, adjusting his position to stay close as the temperature dropped. His fur brushed against Ethan's hand. Ethan inhaled sharply. The texture was wrong. Thicker, coarser, older. Not Gunner. The realization didn't bring relief. It brought something heavier. The memory continued anyway. There had been a moment, a fraction of a second where Gunner froze, not stiff with fear, but alert, focused, a signal Ethan recognized instantly. Then the world exploded. The sound wasn't loud at first, it was pressure. A violent shove that lifted him off his feet and erased the space between one heartbeat and the next. The ground slammed into him with a force that drove the air from his lungs. He remembered reaching for the dirt, trying to orient himself, trying to understand why nothing below his waist responded. He remembered shouting Gunner's name. He remembered not hearing an answer. In the park, Ethan's jaw tightened. His breathing slowed deliberately, the way they had taught him after the hospital. Count in, count out, stay here. Rain slid down his cheek, cold enough to feel like a tear without the release. The dog at his feet stirred, sensing the shift. He lifted his head just enough to look up at Ethan, amber eyes catching what little light filtered through the clouds. Ethan looked back. Those eyes were different, older, worn in a way that suggested distance, travel, time, waiting. The word landed quietly. Waiting was something Ethan understood. After the injury, there had been so much waiting. Waiting for surgeries, waiting for results, waiting for physical therapy appointments that left him exhausted and hollow. Waiting for people to stop asking how he was doing with that careful tone that meant they didn't really want the answer. Waiting for the feeling in his legs to come back, even though he knew it wouldn't. Waiting became a way to avoid admitting that things had changed. Around them, the park continued its slow decay into winter. Leaves clung to branches longer than they should have, heavy with moisture. Others lay flattened against the path, their bright colors dulled into browns and reds that blended into the mud. Nothing here was dramatic. Nothing was clean. The cold crept in gradually, seeping through Ethan's jacket, settling into his shoulders. He noticed it without reacting, the way he used to notice discomfort on patrol and file it away. Not a threat. Not yet. The dog's head pressed more firmly against him as the temperature dropped, not demanding attention, just sharing warmth. Ethan's thoughts shifted again, unprompted. He remembered the moment they told him Gunner was gone. Not the explosion, the aftermath. A medic with dirt on his face and a voice too calm. A hand on Ethan's shoulder that lingered just a second longer than necessary. Ethan had nodded. Of course he had. He always nodded. Inside, something had gone quiet. Not shattered, not broken. Muted. The park came back into focus. A leaf detached from a branch overhead and spiraled down, landing on the wet ground beside the dog's paw. The dog watched it fall, ears twitching once, then returned his gaze to Ethan. "You're still here," the look seemed to say. Ethan didn't cry. The feeling wasn't sharp enough for that. It was slower, heavier, like something thawing that had been frozen too long to remember what warmth felt like. He became aware of his own body again. The weight of the blanket Frank had tucked around his legs before they left the house, the tension in his shoulders, the faint ache in his lower back from sitting too long, all sensations he had learned to ignore. Now they registered. Frank shifted behind him, boots crunching softly on the wet path. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, careful not to startle. Ethan took a moment before answering. "I think so," he said. It wasn't a lie. The dog exhaled, a long breath that fogged the air briefly before disappearing into the rain. Ethan looked down at him again, really looked this time. At the scars barely visible beneath the wet fur, at the way his paws trembled not from fear, but exhaustion, at the patience in his stillness. This dog wasn't begging. He wasn't searching for rescue in the way people expected. He was waiting. Waiting was not weakness. Ethan knew that now. Waiting was endurance. The rain continued to fall. The leaves continued to rot back into the earth. The cold continued to settle in. And in the middle of it, a man who had spent years numbing himself to survive realized something quietly, without ceremony. He could still feel. and for the first time since the war. That didn't scare him as much as it used to. The first night, Ethan didn't say the dog could stay. He also didn't say he had to go. That was how most decisions happened in the Walker house these days. They simply remained unresolved long enough to become reality. Frank was the one who finally broke the silence. He stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the German Shepherd lie curled on the rug beside Ethan's wheelchair. The dog hadn't eaten much. He hadn't slept deeply either. Every few minutes his head lifted, eyes tracking Ethan's smallest movement. "He's exhausted," Frank said, "but he won't relax." Ethan stared straight ahead. "He shouldn't be here. Neither should half the things we keep." Frank replied gently. "Doesn't mean they don't belong." Ethan didn't answer. When Frank brought out an old towel and knelt to wipe mud from the dog's paws, the shepherd stiffened. His muscles locked, eyes sharp, ready for pain that didn't come. "It's okay," Frank murmured, slow and deliberate. "No one's hurting you." The dog didn't pull away, but he didn't lean in either. Ethan noticed that. That night, the rain picked up again. Wind rattled the windows hard enough to make the house creak. Ethan lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the storm. Then he heard it. A soft shuffle. A pause. The faint click of claws on hardwood. Ethan turned his head towards the doorway. The German Shepherd stood there, uncertain, ears low, but eyes alert. He didn't cross the threshold. He waited. "You don't have to guard me," Ethan said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." The dog didn't move. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Fine," he muttered. "Suit yourself." The dog curled up on the floor beside the bed, back against the wall, positioned where he could see both Ethan and the door. Frank watched from the hallway, unseen, his chest tight with something that felt dangerously close to hope. The next morning brought sunlight, thin and reluctant, filtering through low clouds. The storm had passed, leaving the city damp and quiet. Ethan wheeled into the kitchen to find Frank on the phone, his voice low. Yes, I understand. No, he's not aggressive. I just want to know our options." Frank hung up when he noticed Ethan listening. "Animal control," Frank said before Ethan could ask. "Someone reported a stray in the park yesterday." Ethan's jaw tightened. "So what happens now? They'll send someone out, eventually?" Ethan looked down at the dog, who sat perfectly still at his side, ears twitching at the word stray. "He's not going back out there," Ethan said. Frank nodded. "That's what I told them." That afternoon, Frank insisted they take the dog to a veterinarian. Ethan argued at first, but not with much conviction. He knew the truth. If they were going to keep him even temporarily, someone needed to look at those scars. The clinic was busy, full of restless animals and tired owners. The German Shepherd walked beside Ethan's wheelchair with practiced precision, never crossing the path of the wheels, never lagging behind. People noticed. A woman whispered to her husband. A man near the counter frowned, uneasy. "That dog looks trained," someone said. "He looks dangerous," another muttered. The shepherd ignored them all. Dr. Lisa Moreno was in her late 40s, calm in the way only experience could teach. She crouched to the dog's level, offering the back of her hand. The dog sniffed once, then sat. "Well," she said softly, "that tells me something already." As she examined him, her expression shifted, professional at first, then concerned. "These scars aren't accidental," she said. "Bite wounds, old and new, defensive pattern." Ethan felt heat rise in his chest. "Someone hurt him?" "Yes," Dr. Moreno replied, repeatedly. She ran the scanner along the dog's shoulder. The beep was sharp and unmistakable. Dr. Moreno straightened slowly. That's a military-grade microchip. Frank leaned forward. Military? Ethan froze. What does that mean? It means, she said carefully, this dog wasn't meant to be a pet. She tapped at her computer, brows furrowing as data loaded. The ID is flagged, listed as missing. Missing from where? Ethan asked. Dr. Moreno hesitated. A federal working dog program. He disappeared during transport months ago. The room felt smaller. So what happens now? Frank asked. Dr. Moreno met Ethan's eyes. By protocol, I'm supposed to report this. Ethan's hands curled into fists. You're saying they'll take him? Yes. The dog sensed the shift instantly. He stood, pressing close to Ethan's chair, body rigid, ready. Ethan placed a hand on his neck without thinking. The warmth grounded him. They won't just take him, Ethan said. They'll put him back in a cage. Dr. Moreno's voice softened. I can delay. A day, maybe two. But I can't stop it. Ethan wheeled closer, his voice low and steady. He walked across half the state to get here. Dr. Moreno blinked. What? He didn't wander, Ethan said. He came to me. Frank watched his son carefully. This wasn't the withdrawn man who stared out windows. This was someone awake. You're asking me to ignore federal property law, Dr. Moreno said quietly. Ethan nodded. I'm asking you to see him. She looked at the dog again. At the scars. At the discipline in his stillness. Finally, she sighed. I'll make some calls. Outside, as they waited, a uniformed officer stepped into the clinic. He glanced at the shepherd and stiffened. That the dog? He asked. Frank's heart dropped. Before he could answer, Ethan spoke. He's under medical evaluation. The officer raised an eyebrow. Sir, that animal is registered government property. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He's a living being. Ethan said, not a wrench, not a rifle. The officer hesitated, unsure. Dr. Moreno returned, her face unreadable. I've spoken to my contact. There's some confusion in the records. We have time. How much? Frank asked. Enough, she replied. The officer frowned, then shrugged. I'll check back. When he left, the tension didn't disappear. Ethan looked down at the dog. They're going to come for you. The dog met his gaze, steady and unafraid. Keeping you would be harder, Ethan said quietly. Easier to hand you over. The dog didn't move. Ethan swallowed. I've done the easy thing before. He rested his hand fully on the dog's head. This time, he said, more to himself than anyone else, I choose harder. The dog leaned into his touch, just slightly, and in that small, deliberate gesture, a line was crossed that could not be uncrossed. The truth did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, the way real truths usually do, in pauses, in paperwork, in conversations that were never meant to connect, but somehow did. 2 days passed. The German shepherd stayed close to Ethan through all of it. He moved with quiet purpose through the house, never lying down unless Ethan was settled, never sleeping deeply enough to miss a sound. At night, he positioned himself between Ethan and the front door. During the day, he watched the street through the window, head tilted, ears tracking every unfamiliar engine. Frank noticed something else, too. The dog never asked for anything. Food was taken only after Ethan nodded. Water only after Ethan moved. When Frank tried to coax him into the backyard, the dog waited for Ethan's hand to lift first. He's not confused, Frank said one evening, watching from the kitchen. He's oriented. Ethan didn't answer. He was focused on brushing mud from the dog's coat, his movements careful, deliberate. The scars emerged slowly as the fur dried. Some were thin and white, old enough to have faded. Others were thicker, Pink, uneven. They tried to break him. Ethan said quietly. Frank swallowed. And they didn't. No, Ethan said. They didn't. The call came the next morning. Dr. Moreno's voice was lower than usual, stripped of its professional buffer. Ethan, I need you to come in. There's more. They drove in silence. The city looked unchanged. Traffic lights cycled. Coffee shops opened their doors. Somewhere, a normal morning was happening. In the exam room, Dr. Moreno didn't sit behind the desk. She stood beside the computer, hands braced on the counter. I accessed deeper records, she said. Not supposed to, but I did. Ethan nodded once. What did you find? She turned the screen toward him. A file filled the monitor. Designations, dates, training logs, redacted sections, then a name. K9 Gunner. Ethan's breath left him in a single, sharp exhale. That's not possible, he said. Dr. Moreno didn't look away. That dog you worked with overseas was registered under a different program, but the genetic markers match. She scrolled. This shepherd is Gunner's offspring, born shortly before your last deployment. One of the trainers kept the litter unofficially. They weren't supposed to, but it happens. Frank felt the room tilt. You're saying... I'm saying this dog didn't wander here by chance. Ethan stared at the screen, his vision blurring at the edges. Images rose, uninvited. Gunner trotting ahead on patrol. Gunner pressing against his leg before missions. Gunner sitting at his side during quiet nights, eyes alert even in rest. Why was he missing? Ethan asked, his voice flat. Dr. Moreno hesitated. Because someone stole him. The word landed hard. There's an illegal network, she continued. They target working breeds, strong dogs, smart ones. They use them for fighting, breeding, sometimes worse. Ethan looked down at the shepherd sitting beside his chair. The dog lifted his head at the sound of Ethan's voice, eyes steady. They tried to make him violent, Ethan said. Yes, Dr. Moreno replied, and he refused. Frank felt something break open in his chest. So they just let him go? No, she said softly. He escaped. Silence filled the room. Ethan leaned back, the weight of it settling slowly. He didn't run away, he said. He ran toward something. Dr. Moreno nodded. Toward you. Ethan closed his eyes. The memory of Gunner's final look came back with painful clarity. Not fear, not confusion. Trust. He waited. Ethan whispered. The dog shifted closer, pressing his shoulder against the wheel of the chair. I failed him, Ethan said suddenly, the words rough and raw. I failed Gunner. I didn't get him out. I didn't protect him. Dr. Moreno shook her head gently. You survived. That's not the same thing. Ethan's hand trembled as it rested on the dog's neck. And now this one shows up, broken, scarred, still doing his job. Frank spoke for the first time. Maybe this isn't about failure. Ethan looked up at him. Maybe, Frank continued. It's about something coming back around, something that didn't get finished. The shepherd let out a low breath, almost a sigh. Dr. Moreno cleared her throat. There's more. The authorities will push harder once the lineage is confirmed. Legally, he's still government property. Ethan's jaw tightened. They'll put him back in a system that lost him. Yes. And if I fight it? She met his gaze. You'll need grounds, purpose, a reason that isn't just emotional. Ethan thought of the park, the rain, the head resting on his lap. He chose me, Ethan said. That might not be enough. Ethan nodded. Then I'll make it enough. They left the clinic with the truth heavier than anything Ethan had carried since the war. At home the rain returned, softer this time. Ethan wheeled into the living room and stopped, in front of the closet. The door was still closed. The dog sat beside him, watching. They want to take you, Ethan said quietly. The dog didn't flinch. They'll say you belong somewhere else. The shepherd's tail tapped once against the floor. Ethan's voice dropped. You don't. He opened the closet. The prosthetic legs stood where they always had, silent, waiting. The dog tilted his head, curious. Ethan didn't reach for them. Instead, he rested his hand on the dog's head. You walked through hell, he said, and you still came back looking for your handler. The dog leaned into the touch. I lost my role. Ethan continued. Lost my reason. He swallowed. You didn't. The realization hit him then, not as a rush, but as a steady pressure. This dog was not here to replace Gunnar. He was here to finish something. Ethan exhaled, slow and controlled. Whatever comes next, he said, we face it together. The shepherd pressed closer, warm and solid. Outside, rain traced quiet paths down the window. Inside, something long buried had shifted. Not healed, not fixed, but awake. And for the first time since the explosion, Ethan Walker did not feel like something broken waiting to be discarded. He felt like someone needed again. And that, he realized, was the most dangerous truth of all. Justice did not arrive with sirens. There were no dramatic raids splashed across the evening news, no triumphant speeches, no villains dragged away in handcuffs while cameras flashed. Instead, it arrived quietly. In paperwork, in phone calls, in doors that closed without much noise. The first sign was a knock on the front door 3 days later. 2 men stood on the porch, rain jackets zipped high, badges tucked away rather than displayed. They didn't look aggressive. They didn't look apologetic either. Just tired. Like people who had been following something ugly for a long time. Mr. Walker, the taller one said. I'm Agent Harris. This is Agent Cole. We'd like to ask you a few questions about the dog. Ethan didn't hesitate. He wheeled back and opened the door wider. He's here, Ethan said, and he's staying inside. That won't be a problem, Harris replied. We're not here to take him, not today. Frank stood just behind Ethan, silent but alert. The German shepherd remained seated at Ethan's side, posture calm, eyes tracking every movement without hostility. Inside, the agents spoke plainly. They explained that the working dog transport theft had been part of a larger operation. Dogs siphoned off under falsified paperwork, trainers bribed, records quietly altered. The dogs who didn't perform as expected were sold off to underground fighting rings or discarded. We've been following it for over a year, Cole said. Hard to prove, harder to get cooperation. Ethan listened without interrupting. And now? Frank asked. Harris glanced at the dog. Now, someone made a mistake. Ethan raised an eyebrow. The dog escaped. Harris shook his head. Not that one. Someone lower in the chain got scared, turned in a name. That name led to another. Cole added, Once we had the breeding records, the rest started falling apart. No satisfaction flickered across Ethan's face. No sense of victory, just focus. What happens to the dogs? He asked. Harris nodded slowly. That's the question that matters. Over the next week, the answers unfolded. Several arrests were made, but quietly. No press releases, no sensational headlines. Just court dates scheduled, assets frozen, licenses revoked. A few of the men involved took plea deals. Not out of remorse, but out of fear of what the evidence would bury them under. Others vanished into silence, their operations collapsing as the pipeline dried up. One former handler came forward voluntarily, a man with a trembling voice and a stack of documents that smelled like guilt. He testified. He named names. He helped locate dogs that were still alive. Ethan watched from a distance as the system did what it rarely did well. It corrected itself. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Dr. Moreno called late one evening. "They've agreed to reclassify him," she said. "Not as equipment, as a service animal under civilian care." Ethan closed his eyes. Meaning? Meaning he won't be returned to a kennel. He won't be reassigned. He won't disappear. Frank let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "And ownership?" Ethan asked. There was a pause. "That part's complicated. I figured. But," she continued, "they're open to a permanent placement. With you." Silence settled over the room. The dog shifted slightly, pressing his side against Ethan's chair. "What do they want in return?" Ethan asked. "Transparency, periodic check-ins, and—" She hesitated. "They want you to speak, not publicly, just officially, about how you found him, about what he means to you." Ethan stared at the floor for a long moment. "They can keep their interviews," he said finally. "I'll give them facts, nothing else. That should be enough." After the call ended, Frank looked at his son. "You okay?" Ethan nodded once. "This isn't about me." That was the truth. Ethan didn't want apologies from men he'd never meet. He didn't want restitution checks or formal acknowledgements of wrongdoing. He didn't even want to hear the word justice attached to his name. He wanted one thing: that no one ever decided this dog was disposable again. On a damp afternoon a few days later, Ethan and the German Shepherd sat in the park where they had first met. The rain was lighter now, almost polite. Leaves clung to the ground, darker and softer than before. People passed them differently this time. Some smiled, some nodded. One man paused long enough to say, "That's a good-looking dog." Ethan nodded back. "Yeah." The dog rested his head briefly against Ethan's knee, then lifted it again, alert but calm. "You're not a symbol," Ethan said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "You don't owe anyone anything." The dog's tail tapped once. Justice, Ethan realized, didn't need witnesses. It didn't need a crowd. Sometimes justice was simply the absence of further harm. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. The season changed without asking anyone's permission. Winter loosened its grip slowly, reluctantly, as it always did in Seattle. The rain stayed, but it softened. The air lost its bite. Mornings came a little earlier, light slipping through the clouds in thin silver bands that stretched across the floors of the Walker house. Time moved, not in milestones, not in announcements, in repetition. Every morning, Ethan wheeled himself to the same spot near the back window. Same mug, same view of the small yard where grass struggled to grow after months of rain. The German Shepherd followed, always on his left side, matching the pace instinctively. The scars along the dog's flank had faded from angry pink to dull white. His coat had filled in, thicker now, heavier around the neck. His muzzle carried a hint of grey that hadn't been there before. He was aging. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to notice. Ethan noticed everything now. The way the dog took a moment longer to rise from the floor. The way he stretched before walking, front legs first, back legs slower to follow. The way his eyes stayed sharp even when his body hesitated. Waiting had taught him patience. On the kitchen counter, a calendar hung untouched. No days crossed off. No goals written in marker. Progress didn't live there. It lived in the quiet routines. Some afternoons, Ethan would roll into the hallway and stop in front of the closet. He didn't open it at first. He just stood there, hands resting on the wheels, breathing steady. The dog sat behind him. Always behind. Never pushing. Never nudging. Just there. The first time Ethan opened the door, he didn't reach inside. He looked. The prosthetic legs were exactly where they had been. Cleaned now. No dust. Frank had done that quietly one morning without saying a word. Ethan closed the door again. The dog shifted his weight and settled back onto the floor. No reaction, no disappointment. The next day, Ethan opened the door again. This time he touched them. Just the fingertips. Cold metal. Smooth carbon fiber. Nothing about them felt welcoming. He withdrew his hand and sat there longer than necessary. The dog waited. Outside, the rain tapped softly against the windows, steady and familiar. The first attempt came without ceremony. Frank was in the garage. The radio hummed low with an old classic rock station. The house smelled faintly of coffee and clean laundry. Ethan transferred himself onto the edge of the bed and reached for the prosthetics. He didn't look at the dog. He didn't want an audience. The process was awkward, clumsy, straps pulled too tight, then loosened again. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the effort of doing something his body no longer understood. When he finally stood, everything tilted. The world felt wrong at this height, too far away, too unstable. His knees locked instinctively, muscles screamed in protest. He took one step, then another. Then his balance slipped. He fell hard, catching himself with his arms before his face hit the floor. Pain flared sharp and immediate, radiating up through his shoulders. He stayed there, breathing through clenched teeth. Behind him, the dog rose but did not rush forward. He stood, alert, watching. Ethan pushed himself back onto the bed slowly, frustration burning hot and familiar. He stripped the prosthetics off and shoved them aside, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the wall. The dog approached then, careful and quiet. He rested his chin on Ethan's knee, not apologetic, not triumphant. Present. Ethan exhaled and rested his hand on the dog's head. "That's enough for today," he murmured. The dog agreed. Days passed, then weeks. Ethan tried again. And again. Sometimes he managed 3 steps, sometimes only 1. Sometimes he didn't make it upright at all. The dog marked none of it. He waited through success and failure the same way. In the yard, Ethan practiced standing with his hands on the back of a sturdy chair. The ground was still soft from winter, uneven under artificial feet that didn't know how to adjust. The dog stood nearby, tail low, ears alert, eyes fixed on Ethan's center of gravity. When Ethan wobbled, the dog stepped closer, not touching. Ready. Spring crept in quietly. The grass turned greener. Buds appeared on bare branches. Birds returned to the fence line, cautious at first, then louder, bolder. Ethan's movements grew steadier, not smooth, not confident, but consistent. He stood every morning now, even if only for seconds. He stood every evening, even when his legs burned and his patience wore thin. The dog aged alongside him. He slept more. He chased squirrels less. But when Ethan rose, the dog rose too, muscles stiff but determined. Sometimes Ethan would pause, hands gripping the chair, sweat running down his spine, and look down at him. "You don't have to stay," Ethan would say quietly. The dog stayed. No words were exchanged, none were needed. Healing didn't arrive in a single moment. It came in the way Ethan no longer avoided mirrors, in the way he stopped counting his failures and started noticing his balance, in the way the dog trusted that Ethan would rise again, even when he didn't know when. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast warm light across the living room floor, Ethan stood longer than usual. 30 seconds, then 40. His breathing slowed, his shoulders relaxed. The dog sat a few feet away, watching, tail resting on the floor. Ethan didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply stood, and the dog waited. That was how healing happened. Not through breakthroughs, through staying, through trying again tomorrow, through the quiet agreement between a man relearning how to exist in his body and a dog who had learned that waiting was sometimes the strongest act of loyalty there was. The story didn't spread the way people expect stories to spread. There was no viral video, no headline with a clever hook, no interview Ethan agreed to sit through under bright lights. If anyone asked him why, he shrugged and said the same thing every time. It wasn't about me. What happened instead was quieter. It started with a phone call from the local Veterans Affairs Outreach Office. Someone there had heard about a former Marine who trained with a service dog in his own backyard. Someone who wasn't selling anything. Someone who wasn't trying to fix anyone. Just someone who showed up. Ethan almost said no. He sat in his wheelchair that morning, coffee cooling on the table beside him, watching the German Shepherd stretch slowly near the window. The dog rose more carefully now, joints stiff in a way Ethan recognized. Age had begun to leave its signature, subtle but undeniable. "They want me to talk," Ethan said to Frank, who was rinsing dishes at the sink. "To other vets." Frank dried his hands slowly. "Talk about what?" "That I don't know." The dog looked up at the sound of Ethan's voice, ears flicking once, then settled again. Frank leaned against the counter. "You don't have to be an expert to listen." That landed. Ethan showed up the following Tuesday. The community center smelled like old carpet and burnt coffee. Folding chairs were arranged in a loose circle, uneven and imperfect. The people sitting in them looked the same way. Some leaned on canes, some stared at the floor, some laughed too loudly, like they were trying to remind themselves what that sounded like. The dog walked in beside Ethan, vest on, posture calm. No one clapped. No one stared. A few people nodded. Ethan didn't stand in front of them. He stayed in the circle. "I'm not here to motivate anyone," he said after a moment. "I don't have advice." That earned him a few looks. "I just figured sometimes it helps to see someone else still figuring it out." A man across from him snorted softly. "You're telling me." The dog lay down at Ethan's side, head resting against the wheel of the chair. They talked that day. Not about trauma in neat terms, not about recovery timelines. They talked about sleep, about anger that came out sideways, about how people said thank you for your service and didn't know what to do with the answer. Ethan listened more than he spoke. The dog moved when someone's leg shook too hard. When a voice cracked, he didn't draw attention. He didn't force comfort. He stayed close. Word spread the way it always does in small communities. Someone mentioned the group to a friend. A counselor suggested it to a client who refused formal therapy. A school principal reached out after hearing about a dog that helped veterans regulate without commands or pressure. Ethan found himself wheeling into a middle school gym one Thursday afternoon, the smell of floor polish sharp in the air. Students sat cross-legged on the floor, whispering and nudging each other until a teacher raised a hand. "This is Mr. Walker," she said, "and this is his dog." The dog sat quietly at Ethan's side, tail tucked neatly, eyes alert but soft. Ethan cleared his throat. "I'm not here to tell you a heroic story." That got their attention. "I'm here to tell you that sometimes people come home different, and sometimes they don't know how to explain that." A girl in the front row raised her hand. "Did your dog save you?" Ethan considered the question carefully. "No," he said. "He stayed." The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. At the local veterans' hall, an older man with a navy cap pulled low over his eyes watched the shepherd work the room. Not perform, just exist. "That dog's not trying to be anything." The man muttered. Ethan nodded. "Neither am I." The dog became something people recognized, but never owned. He wasn't a mascot. He wasn't a miracle. He was a reference point. When a new veteran walked into a room stiff with nerves and saw the dog lying calmly beside Ethan, something in their shoulders softened. When a conversation stalled and no one knew what to say next, the dog shifted positions, broke the tension without demanding attention. "He reminds me of my old partner," someone said once. Ethan replied, "Me too." The house filled with visitors over time. Not crowds, just one or two at a time. Coffee shared at the table. Silence respected. Frank learned to keep extra mugs clean without asking questions. The backyard changed too. The grass grew thicker from being walked on daily. Ethan practiced standing there now, not for distance, but for presence. The dog waited nearby, slower than he used to be, but steady. Some evenings they sat together on the porch, watching the light fade behind the trees. Neighbors waved, kids slowed their bikes. No one rushed them. "Healing isn't loud," Frank said once, watching from the doorway. Ethan nodded. "It doesn't need to be." The dog sighed and rested his head against Ethan's leg. The legacy wasn't a building or a foundation or a plaque on a wall. It was smaller. It lived in rooms where people stayed a little longer than they planned, in conversations that didn't end with solutions, in the quiet understanding that broken didn't mean useless. The story kept moving, not forward in a straight line, but outward, gently, touching lives without announcing itself. And in the middle of it, a man and a dog continued to do what they had always done best. They stayed. And somehow, that was enough. The afternoon settled the way it always did now. Quietly. Light filtered through the thin clouds, not bright, not dramatic, just enough to soften the edges of the day. The porch boards were warm beneath the late sun. A breeze carried the distant sound of traffic and the faint call of a gull drifting in from the water. The German shepherd lay at the edge of the porch, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but never fully asleep. His chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. Every so often, his ears twitched at a sound only he noticed. Guarding did not require movement. It required presence. Ethan sat nearby, coffee cooling in his hands, legs stretched out in front of him. The prosthetics were on. Not because he planned to go anywhere, not because someone expected it, just because he chose to. They no longer felt like enemies. They were tools now, imperfect ones, heavy, sometimes painful, sometimes frustrating, but no longer symbols of everything he had lost. They were part of the story. Across the yard, the grass had grown uneven, where it had been worn down by repetition. Standing, sitting, standing again. There were no markers of achievement, no lines drawn to show progress, only signs of use. Frank watched from inside, giving them space. He had learned when to step in and when to let moments belong to someone else. This was one of those moments. Ethan looked down at the dog. "You still watching the door?" he asked quietly. The dog's tail moved once against the wood. Ethan smiled. Not the kind that asked for permission. Not the kind that tried to convince anyone of anything. Just recognition. There had been a time when Ethan believed that being lost meant being forgotten. That once you stopped moving forward, the world moved on without you. That loyalty had an expiration date. War taught him how quickly everything could disappear. The dog taught him something different. That some things wait. That some bonds are not built on usefulness or speed or strength. They are built on staying. A neighbor passed by on the sidewalk and raised a hand in greeting. Ethan returned it. No conversation followed. None was needed. The dog did not move. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched across the yard. The day folded itself gently towards evening. Ethan rested his hands on his thighs and took a slow breath. They thought he was lost forever. He said softly, more to the moment than to the dog. The shepherd opened one eye, calm and unbothered. But some loyalty doesn't stop just because time passes. The words hung there, not as a declaration, but as a truth that did not require agreement. Inside the house, life continued. A radio murmured somewhere. A kettle clicked as it cooled. Ordinary sounds, ordinary comfort. Ethan sat there longer than he needed to. The dog waited. If you are still here, still listening, maybe this story reminded you of someone. Someone who waited. Someone who stayed when it would have been easier to walk away. Someone you thought was gone, but never really was. Stories like this do not ask you to believe in miracles. They ask you to remember. And sometimes remembering is enough to bring something important back into the light.